Today, we're diving into one of the most brutal and, frankly, forgotten conflicts of the 1990s, the First Chechen War. It was an absolute turning point for post-Soviet Russia, ending in a shocking defeat for a global superpower, a defeat that really set the stage for decades of violence to come. And to really get how badly this all went for Moscow, you have to start with this quote. It's from Russia's defense minister at the time, Pavel Grachev. As his tanks were literally rolling toward Chechnya, he boasted that this whole thing would be a bloodless blitzkrieg and that he could take the capital with a single airborne regiment in just a couple of hours. Well, that's not quite what happened. Yeah, that bloodless blitzkrieg, it never happened. Instead, the war became a nearly 2-year-long meat grinder that completely devastated the region, created hundreds of thousands of refugees, and killed tens of thousands of people. So the big question is, how did Moscow get it so spectacularly wrong? Well, to understand the war in 1994, you have to realize it didn't just come out of nowhere. Not at all. It was really the bloody climax of centuries of Chechen resistance against Russian rule. This fight for independence has incredibly deep roots.
I mean, just look at this timeline. You can see this constant cycle of rebellion and conquest. It goes all the way back to the 1700s. But the most traumatic event in living memory was, without a doubt, 1944. That's when Stalin ordered the deportation of the entire Chechen nation to Central Asia and Siberia. So you can imagine when the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, a former Soviet general named Jokhar Dudayev seized the moment and declared Chechnya an independent nation.
Now, while Moscow was letting other Soviet republics go, it drew a hard line at Chechnya. They saw it as an inseparable part of Russia. At first, they tried some covert stuff, backing rival factions to overthrow Dudayev. But when that failed miserably, President Boris Yeltsin made the fateful call, send in the army and restore constitutional order by force. And that brings us right back to that infamous bloodless blitzkrieg. The plan seems simple enough on paper. A 3-pronged tank assault to quickly encircle the capital, Grozny, and force everyone to surrender. But from the very first day, the entire plan just fell apart. The invasion was just a total mess right from the start. You had unarmed civilians in neighboring republics literally standing in the middle of the road blocking Russian tank columns. But what was truly shocking was the dissent inside the Russian military. We're talking about a post-Soviet army that was completely demoralized, underfunded, and full of young conscripts who had no idea what they were even fighting for. Over 800 soldiers flat out refused to go, and some of the top generals quit on the spot, calling the invasion order a crime. And this quote right here just captures the absolute dread in the high command. This is from General Boris Gromov, a famous veteran who was the last Soviet commander to leave Afghanistan. He resigned in protest, went on TV, and warned the world that this was going to be another Afghanistan. And boy, was he right.
All of those early failures just funneled the conflict into its horrific centerpiece, the battle for the capital city, Grozny. The fight for this city would become one of the most destructive urban battles of the entire late 20th century.
Believing the Chechens would be celebrating and off their guard, the Russian command ordered a massive armored assault right on New Year's Eve. It was an unmitigated disaster. Russian tank columns, driven by kids with barely any training, just rolled into the city center and were systematically hunted down. They were picked off one by one. Entire units, like the famous 131st Mykup Brigade, were practically wiped off the map. Just think about this number. In that single initial attack, it's estimated that 2,000 Russian soldiers were either killed or went missing. An entire generation of young men just gone in a matter of days. So what went wrong? Well, it was a total clash of strategies. The Russians were relying on brute force, tanks, artillery, airstrikes. But the Chechens used the city itself as a weapon. They had these small, mobile hunter-killer teams with rocket-propelled grenades. They'd just pop out of basements, hit a tank's weak spots, and then vanish back into this urban labyrinth. Russia's huge advantage in firepower was completely neutralized. After that initial ground assault failed so badly, the Russian strategy shifted. They decided to just level the city. What followed was a bombardment so intense it's been called the heaviest in Europe since the destruction of Dresden in World War II. An estimated 35,000 civilians were killed in the shelling, and that number includes 5,000 children. The Russians did eventually take what was left of Grozny by March 1995, but the war was nowhere near over. In fact, it was just shifting into an even more brutal phase. The Chechen fighters simply melted away into the mountains and the countryside and launched a full-blown insurgency. And from there, the brutality just escalated on all sides. You had Russian cleansing operations like the Samashki massacre, where hundreds of civilians were killed. In retaliation, Chechen commanders like Shamil Basiev decided to take the war into Russia, storming a hospital in a Russian town and taking 1,500 people hostage to force peace talks. And even after the Russians managed to assassinate the Chechen president with a guided missile, the resistance just kept on fighting, wiping out Russian columns in devastating mountain ambushes. By the summer of 1996, the Russian military thought it was finally on the verge of victory. They believed the rebellion was all but crushed. And that is exactly when the Chechens launched their most stunning and audacious attack of the entire war, Operation Jihad, a secret plan to retake Grozny. And it was unbelievably successful. Just 1,500 fighters managed to sneak back into the capital they'd lost a year earlier. And in just a few hours, they surrounded and trapped the entire Russian garrison. We're talking over 10,000 soldiers, inside the very city they thought they controlled. The recapture of Grozny was a complete and utter humiliation for Moscow. The Russian military was collapsing, the public was fed up, and the political will to keep fighting had completely evaporated. This set the stage for the war's shocking conclusion. See, back in Moscow, Boris Yeltsin was in the middle of a tough re-election campaign, and this incredibly unpopular war was a huge political problem for him. He saw the writing on the wall, so he sent his national security advisor, a popular former general named Alexander Lebed, to negotiate a peace deal directly with the Chechens. And this is what they came up with, the Kasavayurt Accord. It was pretty simple, really. It called for an immediate ceasefire and, crucially, a complete withdrawal of all Russian forces. As for Chechnya's ultimate status, whether it would be independent or not, they basically just kicked that can down the road, agreeing to decide in 5 years. And what was the price of that peace? Well, just look at these numbers. They are staggering. And the fact that they vary so wildly tells you a lot about the chaos of this war. Russia's official numbers are on the low end, but independent estimates put the number of dead Russian soldiers as high as 14,000. And for civilians, it's just horrific. The estimates range anywhere from 30,000 to over 100,000 people killed. No matter how you slice it, the outcome was undeniable. Russia, a nuclear superpower, was militarily defeated by a small, determined insurgency. The war ended with Chechnya achieving de facto independence, but at a terrible price. The republic was in ruins, and over 500,000 people, more than half the population, had been forced from their homes. So Russia pulled out, a formal peace treaty was signed, and for a moment there was peace. But the fundamental issues that started the war were never resolved. Chechnya was left a broken, lawless state, and you can bet that hardliners back in Moscow were already plotting their revenge. So it leaves us with one last question. Was this really the end of the war, or was it just a pause before the next one?